My name is Grace Whitmore. I'm 36 years old, a mother to a 7-year-old boy, and until recently, I believed I was living a very ordinary, carefully built life in a quiet suburb outside Boston. If you met me at a school fundraiser or standing in line at the grocery store, you probably wouldn't remember me. I'm not the loudest voice in the room. I don't interrupt. I don't correct people when they underestimate me. Most people describe me as steady, gentle, or my least favorite word, nice. Nice women don't make waves. Nice women hold families together. Nice women trust their husbands. That's who everyone thought I was, including my husband. For years, I played the role well. I handled schedules, meals, pediatric appointments, and thank you cards to my parents. I smoothed over tensions. I believed that love meant absorbing discomfort quietly. I believed loyalty meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt, even when doubt kept returning. And then one afternoon, I received a phone call that shattered the structure of my life in less than 60 seconds. My son had been taken. At least that's what I was told. What followed was a nightmare no mother is ever prepared for. Fear so sharp it feels chemical, hours that stretch like years, and the sickening realization that the person orchestrating the chaos might not be a stranger at all. This is the story of how I discovered that my husband had staged our child's kidnapping in an attempt to extort a ransom from my wealthy parents. It is the story of how the man I loved was willing to put our child through a traumatic ordeal just to get his hands on my family's inheritance. But more than that, this is the story of how a woman who is perceived as quiet and compliant learned the difference between silence and strength. I'm not here to dramatize what happened. I won't scream on camera or call him a monster. Real betrayal doesn't look like a thriller movie. It looks like ordinary mornings, shared coffee cups, and school permission slips. It looks like trust, slowly eroded. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. Not the sensational version, the honest one. The small details that mattered. The moments I ignored. The decision I made that changed everything. Not with revenge, but with clarity. Because sometimes the most powerful response isn't confrontation, it's precision. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever realized that the person who underestimated you the most was the one standing closest? Before everything happened, I was lucky. That's the word people used. Lucky to have grown up with security. Lucky to have married young. Lucky that my parents helped us with the down payment on our house. Lucky that I could afford to stay home with our son. Lucky women, apparently, are expected to be grateful and quiet. My husband, Daniel, used to introduce me with a half smile at dinner parties. "This is Grace. She doesn't have to work." He meant it as a joke. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. What he didn't say was that I had chosen not to return to corporate law after our son was born. That I had graduated top of my class, that I still handled the long-term investment allocations tied to my family's estate because my father trusted my judgment more than any external advisor. Those details didn't fit the narrative. To Daniel's friends, I was the gentle wife who refilled drinks. To his parents, I was the agreeable daughter-in-law from a well-off family. To my own parents, I was the sensitive one, the peacemaker. And slowly, without realizing it, I became small inside those expectations. Daniel was charismatic in public. He worked in commercial real estate, ambitious, restless, always chasing the next deal. I admired that about him at first. His energy felt like momentum, like movement. I thought we balanced each other, but balance is delicate. In private, he sometimes spoke about money with a tone that made my stomach tighten. "Must be nice," he'd say lightly when my parents paid for a family vacation. "Your dad never has to worry about things as I do." It wasn't accusatory, not exactly, more like a quiet comparison. At first, I interpreted it as insecurity. I told myself, of course he feels pressure. Of course, it's hard to build something next to inherited stability. So I softened, I reassured, I minimized my own financial literacy so he wouldn't feel overshadowed. When investment statements arrived, I skimmed them alone and stored them away. When my father mentioned estate planning, I changed the subject in front of Daniel. I thought I was protecting his pride. What I didn't see then was how that silence was being interpreted. Not as kindness, as leverage. To Daniel, I was safe, predictable, loyal, someone who would never suspect him, someone who would never question him publicly, someone who, in a crisis, would panic, not calculate. And perhaps the most dangerous assumption of all, someone who would never act against him. Looking back now, I understand something uncomfortable. People don't just underestimate you randomly. They underestimate you because you've allowed them to build a version of you that serves them. I wasn't invisible. I was convenient. Daniel believed I would always choose harmony over confrontation, that I would absorb tension rather than expose it. That motherhood had softened me into dependency. He mistook calm for passivity. He mistook gentleness for incapacity. He mistook love for blindness. And for a long time, he was right. If you had asked me back then when things first began to feel off, I wouldn't have been able to give you a dramatic moment. There was no slamming door, no missing money, no late-night confession, just a small cut. The kind you barely notice until it stings underwater. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I remember because I was sorting through our son Oliver's school artwork at the kitchen island. Construction paper rockets, crooked handwriting, a spelling test he was proud of. Daniel came home earlier than usual. He looked tense but energized, the way he did when a deal was close to closing. "Hey," he said, dropping his briefcase. "I've been thinking." That phrase always meant something financial. He poured himself sparkling water and leaned against the counter. "What would your parents say if we needed temporary help just to bridge something?" Shh. I looked up. "Bridge what?" "Nothing dramatic," he said quickly. "Just liquidity. There's an opportunity. If I move fast, it could double in 6 months." He didn't meet my eyes when he said it. I asked reasonable questions. Numbers, structure, risk. He answered vaguely, brushing past specifics the way someone waves off smoke before it becomes visible. "It's complicated," he said. "You wouldn't want to get into the weeds." I almost smiled at that. I had spent years in the weeds professionally, but I didn't correct him. Instead, I said gently, "My parents don't do informal loans, Daniel. You know that. Everything is structured." He exhaled sharply, not angry, just irritated. "Right, structured, paperwork, oversight." A pause. "Must be nice to have that safety net." There it was again. Must be nice. The words weren't loud, they weren't cruel, but something about the repetition made them feel pointed now. "I've never thought of it as a net," I said quietly. "It's a responsibility." He laughed lightly, as if I'd missed the joke. "Grace, come on. You'll inherit more money than I'll ever earn." It was the first time he had said that so plainly. Not your family, not your dad, you. I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not yet. Just awareness. "My inheritance isn't ours to plan around," I replied carefully. "It's protected, and it's long-term." He went silent. Not the comfortable silence of two people sharing space, the evaluative kind. That evening, he was unusually affectionate. He helped with Oliver's bath. He ordered my favorite takeout. He kissed my forehead longer than usual. On the surface, it looked like reconciliation, but the small cut had already happened. Because what lingered wasn't the conversation. It was the look he gave me when I said no. Not frustration, assessment. As if he were recalculating. Over the next few weeks, the comments became subtler. Little probes. "Do your parents ever revise the trust structure? Who actually controls disbursements? If something happened to you, what would the process look like?" He framed them as curiosity, financial literacy, future planning, and I answered cautiously, but never completely. At dinner with friends one night, someone joked that I was the real power in the marriage. Daniel squeezed my knee under the table. Too hard. He smiled while doing it. That was the moment I understood something I didn't yet want to name. This wasn't just about opportunity. It was about access. Still, I didn't confront him. I told myself I was being paranoid, that marriages go through financial stress, that ambition can look sharp around the edges. I minimized, because acknowledging the alternative would have required admitting that the person I trusted most might see me not as a partner, but as a gateway. And once you allow that thought in, it never quite leaves. There's something subtle about the way disrespect settles into a marriage. It doesn't arrive announced. It adjusts itself quietly into your daily rhythm. And if you're not careful, you begin to accommodate it without realizing you're shrinking. After that Thursday conversation, Daniel didn't push directly again. Instead, he shifted tone. He started framing financial conversations as if they were burdens he carried alone. "I just don't want to rely on your family forever," he'd say while reviewing spreadsheets late at night. We weren't relying on them. Our mortgage was modest compared to our income. We lived comfortably, but not extravagantly. But he repeated the phrase often enough that it began to sound true. Relying, dependent, behind. He began to reference other men, colleagues who had built everything from scratch, investors who didn't marry into comfort. At first, I thought he was venting, so I listened. When he talked about feeling overshadowed, I reassured him. When he said he needed to prove himself, I encouraged him. When he implied my inheritance created an imbalance, I softened my posture and changed the subject. I told myself this was a partnership. But slowly, something else was happening. He stopped asking for my input on deals. He stopped sharing numbers unless I prompted him. When I did ask questions, he'd smile faintly and say, "Don't worry about it, I've got it handled." It wasn't aggressive. It was dismissive. At dinner with his parents, his mother once said, "Grace is so fortunate that Daniel takes care of everything. It must be nice not to stress." Daniel didn't correct her. He just reached for more wine. I opened my mouth to clarify, then closed it. Because correcting her would have embarrassed him. That became my pattern. Protect his ego, maintain harmony, absorb the distortion. Even when the distortion became personal. One night after Oliver was asleep, Daniel looked at me and said, almost casually, "You've never really had to fight for anything, have you?" The comment was delivered softly, thoughtfully, as if he were analyzing me. I could have listed my academic path, the internships, the late-night studying while working part-time, the decision to step away from a career I loved because we agreed that one parent should be present during Oliver's early years. Instead, I said, "Everyone fights for something." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. But I saw it in his eyes. He didn't believe I understood struggle, and I didn't correct him, because part of me wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe my stability had insulated me. Maybe my calm looked like naivety from the outside. That's how normalization works. You start questioning your own perception before you question theirs. There were other small things. He began making financial decisions without discussion, larger credit lines, riskier partnerships. When I raised concerns, he framed them as fear. "You're risk-averse because you've never had to bet on yourself," he said once. I internalized that. Maybe I was too cautious. Maybe I didn't understand entrepreneurial pressure. So I retreated further. I focused on Oliver, on school volunteering, on managing the house, on keeping everything smooth. If Daniel felt insecure, I would be steadier. If he felt judged, I would be gentler. If he felt pressured, I would be patient. What I didn't recognize was that my silence wasn't calming him. It was confirming his narrative, that I was passive, that I would endure, that I wouldn't challenge him, even if something felt wrong. And the most dangerous part? He began to believe it fully. Because when someone tests a boundary and nothing pushes back, they don't assume generosity. They assume permission. Looking back, I can trace the slow shift. Respect didn't vanish. It diluted. Until one day, the man who once admired my intelligence had quietly recast me as someone who wouldn't notice if the ground beneath her moved. And I let him. Not because I was weak, but because I still believed love meant trust, even when trust was starting to fracture. There's a moment in every quiet unraveling when you realize you've been cast in a role you didn't audition for. For me, it wasn't explosive. It was administrative. I was sitting at the dining room table reviewing Oliver's school calendar and updating my Navy planner, the one I've carried for years. Dentist appointment, parent-teacher conference, donation deadline for the literacy fundraiser. Daniel walked in, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a tone he reserved for investors. Confident, persuasive, just on the edge of urgency. "Yes, we have flexibility," he was saying. "There's family backing if needed." Family backing. He didn't glance at me. He didn't clarify. He simply said it as fact. After he hung up, I looked up from my planner. "What did you mean by that?" I asked evenly. He shrugged. "It's optics, Grace. It reassures people." "It reassures them that what exactly?" "That we're secure." We. The word sounded cooperative, unified, but I understood the subtext now. He wasn't referring to our savings. He wasn't referring to his income. He was referring to my family's money. Money he had no legal claim to. Money structured in trusts he couldn't access. Money is protected precisely to prevent impulsive decisions. Yet he was presenting it as leverage in conversations I wasn't part of. That was the moment I understood the role I'd been assigned. Not a partner, not an advisor, not an equal stakeholder. Asset, a reassuring backdrop, a quiet guarantee, a safety net he could reference without permission. And the role came with assumptions that I wouldn't object publicly, that I wouldn't challenge his framing, that I would prioritize unity over accuracy. Reliable, useful, invisible. The pattern extended beyond money. At social gatherings, Daniel began answering questions directed at me. "How's the volunteer work going, Grace?" "She loves it," he'd respond before I could speak. "Keeps her busy." Busy, as if my time were filler, decorative. I started noticing how often he summarized me, reduced me, positioned me as a gentle support to his narrative of striving. It wasn't cruel. It was efficient. A clean storyline. He was ambitious. I was fortunate. He was building. I was maintaining. And because I rarely contradicted him, the story solidified. The final confirmation came during a dinner with my parents. My father asked Daniel about a recent market downturn. It was an open-ended, analytical question. My father respects competence more than charm. Daniel answered confidently but inaccurately. Not wildly wrong, just simplified in a way that suggested surface-level understanding. I watched my father's expression shift slightly. Not judgmental, just observant. I knew the correction, I knew the nuance, but I stayed silent. Later that evening, in the car, Daniel said, "Your dad always looks at me like he's evaluating." "He evaluates everyone," I replied gently. He glanced at me. "You could have backed me up in there." "Backed him up." "You didn't need backing," I said. "You were doing fine." That wasn't what he meant. He wanted reinforcement, validation, alignment regardless of accuracy. He wanted me to prioritize solidarity over truth, and I realized something quietly unsettling. The role I had been given required me to shrink, to soften my competence, to dim my clarity, to offer quiet endorsement without scrutiny. Because if I stood fully in my knowledge, financially, legally, strategically, the dynamic would shift. And Daniel wasn't ready for that shift. So I remained what was expected, calm, agreeable, supportive. But inside, something had begun cataloging details. Not out of suspicion yet, out of recognition. When someone assigns you a role without your consent, you have two options. Perform it indefinitely, or observe it carefully. I chose observation. And Daniel mistook that choice for compliance. The day everything changed didn't begin with tension. It began with sunlight. It was a Saturday morning in early spring. The kind where the air still holds a trace of winter, but the light feels softer, more forgiving. Oliver was at a birthday party. Daniel had left early for what he called a quick meeting. I was alone in the house, rare, quiet, unstructured hours. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen island with my planner open. Not to schedule anything, just to think. There had been a subtle accumulation of unease over the past few months. Not one dramatic red flag, just patterns, repetitions, language that circled money, access, and urgency. I told myself I was overanalyzing, until that morning. Daniel's laptop sat on the dining table, slightly open. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the notification flashing on the screen. Bridge loan proposal, revised terms. I wasn't snooping. The subject line was visible from where I stood. Bridge loan. The same phrase he had used months ago. Something inside me went still. Not angry, not anxious. Still. I walked over and gently lifted the screen. There was no password prompt. Daniel trusted that I wouldn't look. Or perhaps he believed I wouldn't understand what I was looking at. The document wasn't long. It outlined a short-term funding structure for a commercial development. High risk, high leverage, minimal collateral. And then I saw it. A line referencing anticipated family liquidity event. Family liquidity event. No names, no specifics. But the implication was clear. He was signaling future access to funds tied to me. Not current assets, not documented commitments, projected inheritance. My inheritance, It wasn't illegal language. It wasn't even explicitly deceptive. It was suggestive, strategic, presumptive. I closed the laptop gently and returned to my coffee. I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I didn't spiral. Instead, I asked myself one question. If he believes that money is inevitable, what would he be willing to do to accelerate it? The thought frightened me, not because I believed he would do something monstrous, but because I realized I no longer fully knew the answer. That was the shift, not an accusation, clarity. For the first time, I stopped interpreting his behavior through empathy alone. I began evaluating it through risk. Daniel had always been ambitious. That wasn't new. But ambition under pressure can distort judgment, and lately, his deals had been slower to close. His tone at night is sharper. His patience is thinner. There had been phone calls taken outside, increased agitation when Oliver interrupted him, a defensiveness around timelines. None of it was explosive, but combined, it formed a pattern. I opened my planner and turned to a blank page, not to write accusations, to write facts. Dates of conversations, phrases repeated, references to inheritance, mentions of liquidity. I wasn't building a case. I was grounding myself in evidence, because something inside me understood that emotion clouds perception. And if I was going to protect my child, protect myself, I needed clarity, not outrage. That afternoon, when Daniel returned, he kissed my cheek and asked about Oliver's party. I looked at him and saw the same man I had loved for years. Charming, intelligent, capable. But now I also saw something else, calculation. And for the first time, I didn't feel small in that awareness. I felt steady. The shift wasn't loud. It was internal, a quiet decision to stop being a backdrop, to stop assuming goodwill where patterns suggested pressure, to observe without announcing that I was observing. Daniel believed I was still playing the role assigned to me. He didn't know that something fundamental had changed. Silence, I realized, didn't have to mean submission. It could mean preparation. And from that day forward, my quiet became intentional. After that Saturday, I didn't behave differently in any way Daniel could point to. That was intentional. I still asked about his day, still packed Oliver's lunch with handwritten notes, still attended social events on his arm. But internally, I shifted from participant to observer. Silence stopped being something I defaulted to in order to maintain harmony. It became something I used strategically. Daniel, for his part, grew increasingly restless. Deals were slower. Market conditions were tightening. I noticed how often he checked his phone now, how quickly his mood changed based on notifications. One evening, I heard him speaking in his office with the door half closed. "I just need a few more weeks," he said, voice lower than usual. "There's a guarantee coming." Guarantee. The word lodged in my chest. When he came downstairs, I didn't ask who he was speaking to. I didn't ask what the guarantee was. I asked something smaller. "Are you sleeping okay?" I said gently. He looked surprised. "Yeah, what? You seem tired." It wasn't a confrontation, it was an observation. He softened immediately, sat beside me, exhaled. "It's just pressure," he admitted. "Everyone expects momentum. Everyone. Investors, partners, himself. And perhaps silently me. "I believe in you," I said calmly. And I meant it. But belief isn't the same as blindness. Over the next few weeks, I began doing something I had stopped doing years ago. Reviewing our joint financial accounts independently. Not obsessively, quietly. Credit lines had expanded. There were transfers between business entities I wasn't familiar with. Short-term obligations were stacked closer together than was comfortable. None of it is illegal. None of it is catastrophic. But aggressive? Daniel had always been comfortable with risk. What concerned me wasn't the risk itself. It was the timeline. Risk becomes dangerous when urgency enters the equation. An urgency I could feel was building. One afternoon, he mentioned casually, "If anything ever happened to you, your parents would step in for Oliver, right?" The question was framed as estate planning. Responsible, rational. I held his gaze. "My parents would protect Oliver," I said evenly, "but nothing about that would be immediate." He nodded slowly. I didn't miss the way he processed that answer. That was the moment I understood something critical. He was mapping contingencies, and he still believed I wasn't, so I stayed calm. I began moving conversations about my family's financial structures entirely offline. I scheduled a private call with my father, not to alarm him, but to clarify protections already in place. I confirmed what I already knew. All major disbursements required multiple trustees. Inheritance milestones were time-locked. Emergency access clauses were narrow and documented. There was no quick liquidity event, no sudden windfall, and most importantly, no pathway Daniel could influence. That knowledge didn't make me feel victorious. It made me thoughtful. If he was operating under the assumption that something large and accessible was coming, and if pressure continued to mount, what narrative might he construct to justify accelerating it? I hated that my mind even went there. But motherhood changes your threshold for denial. Every time Oliver ran into the kitchen laughing, every time he fell asleep with his hand curled around my sleeve, I felt something sharpen inside me. Protection isn't loud, it's precise. Daniel mistook my composure for comfort. He believed my continued gentleness meant alignment. But silence, when chosen deliberately, creates space. Space to gather information. Space to test patterns. Space to prepare without triggering a reaction. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted clarity. And clarity was beginning to reveal something I could no longer ignore. Daniel wasn't simply stressed. He was cornered. And cornered people don't always choose patience. They choose leverage. The question was, who did he believe his leverage was? Because if the answer was me, then he still didn't understand who he was dealing with. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. After Daniel began taking more calls behind closed doors, after the language of guarantees and bridges became more frequent, I did something very simple. I paid attention, not emotionally, not reactively, systematically. The first thing I did was separate information streams. I created a digital folder under a neutral name, School Documents. Inside it, I began storing screenshots, not out of paranoia, but out of discipline. Loan proposals, email threads referencing timelines, mentions of anticipated liquidity, changes in credit exposure. Everything dated, everything factual. I didn't confront him about what I saw. That wasn't the point. The point was pattern recognition. At the same time, I quietly resumed conversations I had stepped away from years earlier. I met with the estate attorney my father trusted, not to revise anything, but to ask theoretical questions. If someone attempted to represent future inheritance as collateral, I asked casually, would that hold weight? The attorney smiled faintly. Only if trustees consented, and they don't. Even in an emergency? Especially not in an emergency. That word again, emergency. I left that meeting with something invaluable. Confirmation that legally, Daniel had no access. But legal barriers don't prevent emotional manipulation. So I widened my lens. I reviewed Oliver's school pickup permissions. I updated emergency contacts. I verified that all communication regarding Oliver required dual confirmation. Again, not because I suspected something specific, because clarity reduces vulnerability. Daniel never noticed. He saw me organizing paperwork and assumed it was typical Grace behavior. Reliable, administrative, harmless. One evening, I overheard him speaking to someone named Marcus, a partner I had met once at a holiday dinner. I just need a trigger, Daniel was saying. Once that hits, everything stabilizes. Trigger, stabilizes. The language of someone waiting for an event. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I began mapping timelines against external pressures. Interest payments due. Investor check-ins scheduled. Personal credit utilization is creeping upward. The tension curve was steepening. But here's what Daniel never understood. When he stopped consulting me on financial decisions, he assumed I had stopped understanding them. He forgot that before I was a stay-at-home mother, I was trained to read risk structures, to dissect language, to evaluate leverage. And the language he was using wasn't accidental. It was anticipatory. There was one detail that unsettled me more than the rest. A life insurance policy revision. Daniel had increased his policy 6 months earlier. That didn't concern me. Responsible adults do that. But he had also inquired about mine. Not changed it. Inquired. The agent emailed a summary outlining potential payout timelines under unforeseen circumstances. I stared at that phrase longer than I should have. Unforeseen circumstances. I didn't jump to conclusions, but I did something else. I updated my own directives. I ensured that any payout, under any condition, would route through independent trustees before reaching Daniel. Quietly, without announcement. If you had watched our household from the outside during those weeks, you would have seen normalcy. family dinners, soccer practice, shared Netflix evenings. Daniel remained affectionate, engaged with Oliver, occasionally irritable but not volatile. That's what makes clarity so difficult. There was no villain in a black coat, just a man under pressure, and a woman who had stopped assuming that pressure guarantees integrity. The preparation wasn't about punishment. It was about insulation. Because once you understand that someone views you as leverage, you don't confront them immediately. You remove the leverage. Daniel believed the coming months would solve his problems. He believed a financial event, some form of liquidity, would restore balance. What he never noticed was that I had already begun quietly closing every pathway that relied on me. And when pathways close under someone who is cornered, they look for new ones. I didn't know what that would look like yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. If he attempted to manufacture a crisis to force access, he would underestimate the one variable he still thought was predictable: me. The call came on a Tuesday at 2:17 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was folding laundry in the quiet between school pickup and dinner preparation. Ordinary hours, the kind that feel unremarkable until they aren't. The number was blocked. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Hello? There was breathing at first, then a man's voice, altered slightly, too controlled to be spontaneous. "We have your son." The sentence didn't land immediately. My brain rejected it as absurd. "I'm sorry," I said calmly. "Oliver is with us. If you want him back, you'll follow instructions." There are moments when the world fractures into two layers, the external and the internal. Externally, I remained still. My voice did not rise. I did not scream. Internally, something ancient and protective locked into place. "Put him on the phone," I said. A pause. Then a small, trembling voice. "Mom?" Oliver. But not hysterical. Confused, scared, but not panicked. "Sweetheart," I said, steady. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Is anyone being mean?" "No, they said it's a game." "A game." The phone was taken back. "You have 6 hours," the man said. "Contact your parents. Tell them we want $5 million. Cash arrangement instructions will follow." $5 million. Not a random number. A calculated one. Large enough to imply urgency. Small enough to seem plausible within my family's resources. My heart didn't race. It slowed. Because suddenly, every pattern aligned. Bridge loans. Liquidity events. Triggers. Daniel believed there was accessible money. Daniel believed urgency could unlock it. "Proof of life?" I asked evenly. "You heard him?" "No," I said calmly. "I need a current timestamp or this conversation ends." Silence. Then a muffled exchange in the background. I closed my eyes, not in fear, in recognition. There are tones you learn after years with someone. The cadence of breathing, the rhythm of silence before speech, even filtered through distortion. I recognized it, not the altered voice, the pause. The calculation, the way the demand had been structured, too informed, too specific, too aligned with recent pressures. I didn't accuse. Instead, I said something deliberate. "You're asking for something that cannot move in 6 hours. Another pause. "That's your problem." No, it wasn't mine. Because there was something Daniel had overlooked. My inheritance was not liquid. But my authority as Oliver's mother was immediate. "I need instructions in writing," I continued. "And I need confirmation he remains unharmed every hour." The man hesitated again. Not like a criminal improvising, like someone adjusting a plan. That hesitation told me more than the demand itself. When the call ended, I did not collapse. I called the school first. Oliver had been signed out early by his father. No struggle, no alarm. Authorized pickup, of course. Then I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "Hey," he said casually. "Where are you?" I asked. "Work." "What?" "I just received a call," I said evenly. "Someone claiming to have Oliver." Silence. Not shocked silence. Measured silence. "What?" he said finally. And there it was. The private reveal? Not evidence from a bank statement. Not language from a contract. But instinct. The man I loved was willing to orchestrate fear, to stage our child's disappearance, to pressure my parents into accelerating money that was never meant to move. Not because he was evil, because he was desperate. Because he believed I would panic. Because he believed fear would override structure. He underestimated one thing. When a mother feels fear, it doesn't erase clarity. It sharpens it. I didn't confront him on that call. I didn't scream. I said, "Come home," and I began planning my next move. Not as a victim, as the only adult in the room willing to think clearly. When Daniel walked through the front door that afternoon, he looked almost convincing. Concerned, alert, slightly breathless. "What happened?" he asked. I was standing in the kitchen, my planner open on the counter. Not because I needed it, because it grounded me. "I received a ransom call," I said evenly. "They said they have Oliver." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "This has to be a mistake. I picked him up early. He's with—" He stopped, a fraction too late. "With who?" I asked softly. He swallowed. I picked him up because you seem stressed lately. I thought we could surprise you. I dropped him at my mom's." His explanation arrived too quickly, too structured. "Your mother doesn't have him," I said. He stared at me. In that silence, everything became visible. The calculation, the pivot, the dawning realization that I wasn't reacting the way he expected. "Grace," he said slowly, "what are you implying?" I didn't answer immediately, because this was the decision point. I had options. Option 1, confront him directly, accuse him, demand Oliver's immediate return, and threaten exposure. Option 2, panic publicly, call my parents first, triggering exactly the urgency he wanted. Option 3, call the police immediately and let the investigation unfold without giving Daniel room to adjust his narrative. Or Option 4, move precisely. Daniel was watching me carefully now, measuring my breathing, waiting for hysteria. Instead, I asked, "Where is our son?" He held my gaze, and for the first time in our marriage, he looked uncertain. "I told you," he said, "this is crazy." "No," I replied quietly. "What's crazy is structuring a ransom around a 6-hour window when you know my family's assets require trustee approval." His jaw tightened. There it was. Recognition. "You think I would—" he began. "I think," I interrupted gently, "that you are under pressure." Silence expanded between us. "You think I would scare our child?" he asked, voice lower now. "I think you believed you could control the narrative." The shift in his posture was subtle but undeniable, defensive energy turning inward. I realized something critical in that moment. If I escalated emotionally, he would retreat further into denial. If I threatened him, he might double down. But if I removed the leverage, the structure collapsed. "I have not called my parents," I said calmly. His eyes flickered. "I have not transferred money. I have not agreed to anything." He didn't speak. "However," I continued, "I have documented the call, and I am about to contact law enforcement." That was the irreversible line. Not screamed. Stated. "You can't," he said quickly, too quickly. "Why?" "Because if this is real, if someone actually has him, you'll put him in more danger." The argument was logical on its surface. It was also revealing. "How do you know what puts him in danger?" I asked. His silence was answer enough. The truth crystallized with painful clarity. This was never meant to reach law enforcement. It was meant to stay inside the family, inside emotion, inside urgency. I stepped back from the counter. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, "you have one opportunity to bring our son home right now." His face changed. Not rage. Fear. Not to lose money. Of losing control. And in that moment, I made my decision. I walked into the living room, picked up my phone, and dialed. Not my parents. Not a private negotiator. The police. I didn't look at Daniel while it rang. Because I understood something with absolute certainty. If I allowed this to remain private, it would never truly end. If I protected his reputation over our child's psychological safety, I would become complicit. This wasn't about revenge. It was about precedent. He needed to understand that fear could not be weaponized inside our home. The operator answered. I began speaking clearly. "My name is Grace Whitmore. I need to report a suspected staged kidnapping involving my husband." Behind me, Daniel whispered, "Grace, don't." But it was already done. The irreversible choice had been made, not out of fury, out of clarity. And once clarity is spoken aloud, there is no returning to silence. The moment I ended the call with the police, the house felt different. Not louder, heavier. Daniel stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, his composure thinning in quiet increments. "You're overreacting," he said, voice controlled but strained. "This can be handled privately." Handled. As if this were a billing dispute, as if our son's fear were a negotiable detail. "I agree," I said calmly. "It could have been handled privately." The implication hung between us. "You had that option." He looked at me as though seeing a stranger. The police arrived within 15 minutes. 2 officers, professional, neutral. Daniel shifted immediately into cooperative mode, measured answers, mild confusion, supportive husband. "Yes, I picked Oliver up early," he explained. "We were planning a surprise. My phone must have been spoofed. This is probably a scam." It was almost convincing, until one officer asked, "Where's your son right now?" A pause. "My mother's," Daniel replied. The officer made a call. She didn't have him. Daniel's narrative began to thin. I remained quiet during most of the exchange, speaking only when asked. I provided the call time, the phrasing of the demand, the 6-hour deadline. I did not speculate. I did not accuse. I stated facts. Eventually, under pressure, Daniel admitted Oliver was at a short-term rental property connected to one of his business associates. "Just to cool off," he said quickly. "I needed space. We were going to come back later." The officers' expressions didn't change, but the structure of the story had already collapsed. They left to retrieve Oliver. Daniel sat down at the dining table, hands clasped. "You've blown this out of proportion," he muttered. "No," I replied softly. "You did." He looked up sharply. "It was supposed to be temporary," he said. "I was going to call it off." "Call it off?" As if terror were a draft email. "You let him believe it was a game," I said. "You let someone else speak to him." "I never would have let anything happen," he insisted. And I believed that part. That was the tragedy. He hadn't intended harm. He had intended leverage. There's a difference, but not one a child understands. When the police returned with Oliver, he ran straight into my arms. He wasn't hysterical, just unsettled. "Dad said it was a surprise," he whispered. Then a man called. I held him tightly. Daniel reached toward us. Oliver hesitated. That hesitation was the consequence. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just real. The officers informed Daniel that he would need to provide a formal statement at the station. There were questions about false reporting, coercion, and endangerment. Nothing was decided immediately, but the process had begun. That night, after Oliver fell asleep beside me, I opened my planner again, not to document his betrayal, to outline next steps. I contacted my attorney first thing in the morning, not a divorce declaration, yet. A protective consultation. I requested temporary custodial clarity. I froze joint credit access. I notified trustees of a security concern without detailing specifics. Everything was calm, methodical. Daniel assumed the crisis would fade once Oliver was home. He underestimated the nature of the consequence. Consequence doesn't arrive in the form of shouting. It arrives as paperwork, as structured boundaries, as shifts in authority. Within 48 hours, Daniel realized something subtle but irreversible. He no longer controlled the narrative. Not with investors, not with law enforcement, not inside our home. And I never once raised my voice. Because moving in silence doesn't mean staying passive. It means acting before the other person realizes the ground has shifted. Daniel believed fear would rush me into compliance. He never anticipated that fear would activate discipline instead. And discipline is much harder to manipulate. By the end of that week, he was no longer asking me not to call the police. He was asking me not to ruin everything. But everything had already changed. Quietly. Legally. Permanently. Consequences rarely explode all at once. They unfold. The first shift was logistical. Daniel was advised not to stay in the house while the investigation remained open, not formally charged, but formally scrutinized. There's a difference. One carries immediate punishment, the other carries weight. He packed a suitcase that Sunday evening, not angrily, stunned. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said quietly. I believed him. That was the most unsettling part. Intent does not erase impact. Oliver watched from the staircase, small fingers wrapped around the railing. He didn't fully understand what had happened, but he understood change. "Is Dad mad?" he asked me later. "No," I said softly. Dad made a mistake. I chose my language carefully. Not a monster, not evil, a mistake. But some mistakes redraw lives. Over the next few days, Daniel's phone calls shifted in tone. Investors who had once spoken confidently now asked pointed questions. Word travels quickly when police visit business addresses tied to rental properties. He wasn't arrested, but he was questioned. He wasn't convicted, but he was flagged. That's the thing about reputational damage. It doesn't need a headline. It only needs doubt. One of his primary backers paused funding on an upcoming project. Too much instability, Daniel admitted over the phone one evening. Instability. He finally understood the word from the inside. Meanwhile, I remained measured. I attended Oliver's parent-teacher meeting. I scheduled a child therapist, not because he was traumatized, but because prevention matters. I continued volunteer work. From the outside, I was still Grace, steady, calm, functional. But internally, I was restructuring our life. Temporary custody orders were granted pending further review, not as punishment, but as precaution. Daniel could see Oliver, supervised. That word cut him more deeply than any accusation I could have made. "You think I'd hurt him?" he asked during one exchange. I replied evenly, "that you already did. Not physically, psychologically." Trust, once cracked in a child, repairs slowly. The financial consequences began layering quietly. Legal fees accumulated, partnerships dissolved. His short-term loan obligations tightened without anticipated relief. The trigger he had been waiting for never came, because it had never existed. And now, instead of potential liquidity, there was documented instability. One night, he called me past midnight. "I just needed breathing room," he said, voice thinner than I had ever heard it. "I thought if your parents felt urgency, they'd accelerate something, just a portion, enough to stabilize everything." Everything. The word sounded hollow now. "You were willing to scare our son for breathing room," I said softly. Silence. "I thought you'd understand," he whispered. That sentence stayed with me. He believed my loyalty would extend beyond reason, that my empathy would override the boundary, that I would see his pressure and prioritize it over our child's safety. He didn't understand that motherhood recalibrates hierarchy. There is no ambition above protection. As weeks passed, the social consequences deepened. Friends stopped inviting him to certain gatherings, not dramatically, just gradually. His parents called me privately, confused and embarrassed. "Daniel says it was a misunderstanding," his mother insisted. "I'm sure that's how it feels to him," I replied calmly. I didn't argue. I didn't campaign. I allowed facts to exist. And facts have weight. The house felt quieter without him. Not happier. Not triumphant. Just clearer. There's a difference between chaos and tension. Chaos is loud. Tension hums. When the hum disappeared, I realized how long I had been living beside it. Daniel thought the worst consequence would be legal trouble. It wasn't. The worst consequence was this. For the first time, I was no longer protecting his image. And without that protection, the version of him he had carefully curated began to dissolve. Not through attack, through exposure. Slowly, I watched him begin to understand that the real loss wasn't money. It was credibility. And credibility, once fractured, doesn't respond to negotiation. It responds to time. And even then, not always. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like persuasion. About a month after the incident, Daniel asked to meet at a quiet cafe near the courthouse. Neutral ground, public but discreet. He looked thinner, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. "Grace," he began carefully, "this has gone far enough." I waited. "The investigation isn't moving toward charges," he continued. "There's still time to correct the narrative." Correct the narrative, as if this were a branding issue. "What narrative would you prefer?" I asked calmly. That this was a miscommunication, a bad judgment call, not what it's being framed as. "And what is it being framed as?" He hesitated. "Manipulation." The word sat between us like something fragile and undeniable. "I never meant to manipulate you," he said quickly. "I was trying to protect us." "Protect us." I studied his face, the exhaustion, the pride still fighting to remain intact. "You attempted to manufacture urgency around money that wasn't yours," I said evenly. "Using fear." His jaw tightened. "I thought once your parents felt the threat, they'd release something early. Just a portion. They care about Oliver. They care about stability," I corrected softly, "which is why structures exist." He leaned forward, voice lower. "I can fix this." That was the moment I knew he still didn't understand. Fixing implies repair. Repair requires acknowledgement. "What does fix look like to you?" I asked. "I'll step back from the risky projects. I'll restructure. We can go to counseling. We can present this as stress-related." Present, frame, spin. Even now his instinct was optics. "Daniel," I said gently, Oliver hesitated before hugging you. He flinched. That will take longer to repair than any loan structure. Silence filled the space between us. I never would have let him get hurt, he insisted. But you let him get confused, I replied. You let him believe something was wrong with his world. He ran a hand over his face. I was desperate. There it was. The honest word. Desperate. Desperation narrows vision. It prioritizes immediate relief over long-term consequences. It convinces intelligent people that temporary chaos is manageable. But children remember chaos differently from adults do. There were other options, I said quietly. I didn't see them. That's the problem. For the first time, I saw genuine regret. Not fear of legal trouble, not fear of financial collapse, fear of losing us. I'll do anything, he said. Anything. But there are moments when anything arrives too late. I have filed for formal separation, I told him calmly. He went still. This doesn't have to be permanent, he said quickly. You don't have to decide that now. I'm not deciding forever, I replied. I'm deciding safety. The distinction mattered. He searched my face for anger. There was none, only resolve. You used crisis as a tool, I continued softly. I cannot raise a child in an environment where crisis is strategic. He looked down at the table. For the first time, there was no argument left. No reframing, no redirection, just consequence. I thought you'd protect me, he said quietly. I almost smiled. I did, I replied, for years. That was the truth he couldn't undo. I had softened conversations, minimized warning signs, shielded him from scrutiny, offered loyalty beyond what was reasonable. But protection without boundaries becomes permission. And once boundaries are drawn clearly, they cannot be negotiated back into invisibility. When we stood to leave, he looked smaller somehow. Not physically, internally. The confidence that once filled rooms had thinned into something cautious. You're not who I thought you were, he said. I met his eyes steadily. No, I agreed. I'm not. And that wasn't an accusation. It was clarity. Some doors close loudly. Others close with paperwork and steady breathing. This one closed without shouting. But it closed all the same. Too late to fix. Not because I wanted punishment. Because I finally understood that love without structure invites collapse. And I was no longer willing to live inside collapse. The final conversation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in our living room. The house was quiet. Oliver was at school. Sunlight filtered through the same windows that had once framed birthday parties and holiday mornings. Daniel sat across from me, a folder of documents resting untouched on the coffee table between us. Separation agreements, custody structure, asset division. Nothing dramatic, just decisions translated into paper. I've read everything, he said finally. His voice was calm, not defeated, not defensive, just aware. I didn't contest the custody terms, he added. I nodded. He studied the room as if memorizing it. I keep replaying it, he said quietly. The call, the plan. I thought I was being strategic. You were, I replied evenly, just not ethically. He absorbed that without flinching. I never believed you'd call the police, he admitted. I know. There it was. The core miscalculation. You've always handled things privately, he continued. Protected us. Yes, I said, and that protection became part of the problem. He looked at me carefully. I underestimated you. It wasn't said with resentment. It was said with recognition. I allowed that, I answered, for a long time. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was reflective. You could have destroyed me publicly, he said after a moment. You didn't. That wasn't necessary. And it wasn't. Revenge is loud. Consequence is quiet. I was scared, he admitted, not of losing money, of losing momentum, of failing. I know. And I told myself if I could just stabilize things, everything else would fall back into place. But you destabilized the one thing that mattered most, I said softly. Oliver, he nodded. I've started therapy, he said. Not to impress you, just because I don't like who I became under pressure. That was the first statement he'd made that wasn't about optics. It was about introspection. I appreciated that. But appreciation doesn't equal reconciliation. I hope you continue, I said. He looked at the folder again. So this is final? He asked. This structure is, I replied calmly. The future depends on behavior, not promises. He exhaled slowly. I thought ambition made me strong, he said. It can, I answered, if it doesn't override integrity. Another quiet pause. I don't hate you, he said suddenly. I don't hate you either. That was true. Anger had burned off weeks ago, replaced by something steadier. Understanding. Not justification. Understanding. You're different, he observed. I'm clearer, I corrected gently. He gave a faint nod. I always thought your calm meant you needed me more than I needed you. That was convenient, I said, not unkindly. A faint, rueful smile crossed his face. Yes, he admitted. We signed the documents without ceremony. No dramatic pen strokes, no trembling hands. Just signatures. When he stood to leave, he hesitated at the doorway. I never wanted to be your adversary, he said. You weren't, I replied softly. You were my husband, who made a choice. The distinction mattered. He nodded once more and walked out. The door closed with an ordinary click. No slammed wood, no raised voices, just finality. I stood in the quiet living room and felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, not triumph, alignment. For the first time in years, my internal clarity matched my external actions. There was no role left to perform, no ego left to protect, just truth handled calmly. And that, I realized, was the most powerful confrontation of all. It has been a year. Long enough for routines to feel natural again. Long enough for Oliver to stop asking if surprises are safe. Long enough for silence to mean peace instead of tension. People still describe me as calm. That hasn't changed. What has changed is why. Before, my calm was accommodation. Now it's conviction. I returned to legal consulting 6 months after the separation, not out of financial necessity, but intellectual alignment. Structured advisory work, risk analysis, governance review. Ironically, I now help organizations identify vulnerabilities before they become crises. Pattern recognition, it turns out, is transferable. Oliver spends time with his father under a stable custody schedule. Daniel followed through on therapy. He stabilized his career at a smaller firm, less risk, less spectacle. We speak cordially, briefly, respectfully. There is no hostility between us, but there is distance. And distance, in this case, is healthy. The most profound shift didn't happen in court or in paperwork. It happened internally. For years, I believed strength meant preserving harmony. If I stayed measured and kind, problems would soften. What I understand now is this. Kindness without boundaries invites erosion. Silence without strategy invites misinterpretation. Loyalty without discernment invites exploitation. I don't regret loving Daniel. I don't regret trusting him. I regret only the moments I ignored my own perception to protect someone else's pride. There's a difference between empathy and self-abandonment. I used to blur that line. Now I don't. My parents once told me that wealth is not about money. It's about optionality, the ability to choose without coercion. For a long time, I thought that applied only to finances. Now I understand it applies to identity. I am no longer the convenient version of myself. I am no longer the quiet reassurance in someone else's ambition. I am still gentle, still measured, still composed. But that composure is no longer mistaken for passivity, because I don't shrink to make others feel taller. When Oliver asked me questions about that year, carefully, in the way children test emotional ground, I answer honestly, but simply. Dad made a decision when he felt scared, I tell him, and we made new rules to keep everyone safe. He nods, satisfied. Children don't need villains. They need safety. As for me, I no longer feel invisible in rooms. Not because I speak louder, but because I know exactly who I am when I speak and when I don't. Daniel once told me he underestimated me. He was right. But here's what matters more. I no longer underestimate myself. There is power in quiet, but only when quiet is chosen, not imposed. And today, every part of my life is chosen, intentionally, calmly, without apology. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a dramatic lesson, a warning about ambition, a condemnation of greed, a declaration that betrayal always hides behind charm. But real life is more complicated than that. Daniel wasn't a villain in a movie script. He was a man under pressure who convinced himself that urgency justified manipulation. He believed he could stage fear, control the outcome, and then quietly restore normalcy. What he underestimated wasn't my intelligence. It was my threshold. There is a moment in every relationship when you must decide what you are willing to normalize. A small dismissal, a subtle distortion, a strategic lie for the greater good. If you excuse enough of those moments, they compound. And one day you wake up inside a crisis that didn't begin as one. This story isn't about revenge. I didn't ruin him. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't retaliate. I enforced a boundary. Calmly, publicly, permanently. And that changed everything. What I learned is simple but not easy. Love does not require you to abandon clarity. Empathy does not require you to ignore evidence. And silence is only powerful when you control it. If someone in your life underestimates you, ask yourself why. Have you been shrinking to preserve peace? Have you been protecting someone else's pride at the expense of your own stability? Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about alignment between what you know, what you tolerate, and what you act on. I still believe in partnership. I still believe people can grow, but growth does not erase consequence. And protection, especially of a child, will always come before comfort. So I'll leave you with this. If someone you love tried to manipulate your fear for their gain, would you confront them loudly? Or would you respond the way I did, with clarity, structure, and a boundary they could not cross? I genuinely like to know what you would have done. Tell me in the comments.